Gators Breakdown episode 91 is ready to go. Florida, Tennessee. It will happen. Hurricane Irma went away. They still found a way to get this game in Gainesville. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SCC. And joining me for this episode is Will Miles. You can find Will on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Will, thanks for joining us after this, kind of rough week down here in the state of Florida.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I actually live up in Philadelphia now, so for me it was more watching the weather and calling my family and texting them. But certainly doesn't feel like Wednesday. It feels like it should be a Friday at this point. That's for sure.
Tell me about it. Starting Sunday, I went to my normal job at the TV station, Channel 4 WJXT I work for, and it was in hurricane mode. When doesn't matter what your job is at a TV station, when hurricane comes along, it's all hands on deck. So, ran some camera in the studio, a Steadicam thing that I had to do, and then also went out in the elements. It would have been Monday morning after the hurricane kind of came through Sunday night, and checked out a lot of the flooding in downtown Jacksonville. And I tell you, it was really eye-opening. Some people just got power back. Some people still don't have power. I was without power for about 17 hours, I think it was. So, Gators Breakdown was not on the top of my mind, at least. And thanks for everybody out there who tweeted at us and made sure we were okay down here in Florida. Myself and Joe are down here in Florida. Bill lives up in Atlanta. He was checking in with us, and I know Will, you and I talked back and forth a little bit just to kind of see how everything was. And so thanks for all the listeners out there for kind of checking in, and hope all you guys out there are at least have power now, or if not, or at least getting by. And maybe if you're checking out Gators Breakdown, it can be some sort of distraction for what you're dealing with after this big time hurricane.
Yeah, so my brother's down in Fort Myers. They still don't have power yet, and obviously they got hit pretty hard, but hopefully everybody's okay. And I think it could have been worse. I mean, obviously it's bad, but it could have been worse. And just sort of thankful that everybody I know at least is healthy and able to make it through the storm.
For sure. So Gators Breakdown. Talking Tennessee game, we'll dive into it right now. Remember, you can find all your past Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Search on those sites or get the links by following Gators Breakdown on Twitter and on Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Also, when you're on iTunes, please rate and review the show. Jim McElwain on Wednesday had his press conference, after the hurricane went through. Media availability was kind of thrown up in the air a little bit. So Wednesday was the first time the media got to talk to Jim McElwain. And the big takeaway, I think we may kind of have seen this coming or some change coming, but the big announcement was offensive coordinator, the much maligned offensive coordinator, Doug Nussmeier, will move from the sideline and into the booth to call plays versus Tennessee. Will, how do you view this? Is it grasping at straws? Is it a move that could actually spark something? Is it really that much of a difference? The last time Doug Nussmeier was in the booth for Florida, it was the first season under Jim McElwain here at Florida. He was in the booth for that part of it. And I'm having trouble remember if he went down on the field after Greer's suspension and Treon Harris took over, or if he was in the booth the entire time. I can't really remember, but I know he was in the booth for at least part of that season and when Greer was at quarterback. So, maybe something can be made out of that. But how do you see it? Grasping at straws or something that could actually spark something?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it can get worse. So, I guess that's sort of the takeaway is the worst it could be is what it has been. So you make a change and you hope that it sparks something. And, you hope maybe that I think this is also sort of a protective move for Nussmeier, right? That he's certainly going to hear it from the fans. If Twitter is any indication, he's going to hear it from the fans, especially if the offense struggles early. And so, this may be a sort of a preemptive move to protect Nussmeier from the fans and sort of direct their ire towards McElwain and away from Nussmeier. I do wonder, though, whether if the offense struggles, does that frustration then get pointed towards the players? And you'd really kind of rather have them yelling at Nussmeier than you would yelling at the players. So hopefully that doesn't become an issue. I do think being up above the field will help him get a better view of if the offensive line is getting blown back from the line of scrimmage. I think that's something that, you can tell much easier when you're looking from up top than maybe if you're on the sideline. And so maybe some of those plays he'll be able to diagnose a little bit better from being up there.
Yeah, for tendency-wise and stuff, I don't really know how much it changed. I'm sure we've seen him go into a shell of conservative play calling, and if it's not starting well, does him being up there really change anything? Like you said, maybe he sees something different from up there. Maybe he sees something he can exploit. I've always been a fan of the offensive coordinator being in the booth anyway. I kind of understand with Florida's quarterback situation, the way it has been, maybe why he was on the field a little bit. But another thing that I'm kind of interested in is now him being in the booth. Does Jim McElwain take more of a role on the field with the quarterbacks on the offense? Of course, he's still the head coach and he still needs to be involved in every aspect. But now with Nussmeier not being on the sideline, I wonder if McElwain now gets more involved down on the field when Felipe Franks comes off into the sideline. Now you see him kind of quickly mention something to the quarterback, and then the quarterback goes onto the bench and maybe talks with us. But now, I wonder if there's more conversation now between the quarterbacks and McElwain when the quarterback comes off the field.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because McElwain is so involved in all of the in-game decisions that are going on, particularly, do you go for it on fourth down, those sorts of things. And hopefully that doesn't, having to pay attention to the quarterback doesn't pull his attention away from there. But obviously he's going to have to pay some more attention to the offense because what we saw against Michigan isn't going to cut it. And the fan base certainly isn't going to accept that for another week. And so, I think a change had to be made. I think this is probably middle of the road. I think the people who want Nussmeier gone are not going to be pleased by this, and quite honestly, probably aren't going to be pleased by a game where Florida goes out and scores 40 points. I think it'll quiet them down for a week, but I don't think it'll make them go away. So the question is, and this is maybe my biggest issue with this is that, if you had him down, if again, you spent 8 months preparing, you had him on the field, now you're moving him either in response to the criticism or you're saying, well, the 8 months that we spent preparing for that first game, we didn't do the right thing. So you can look at it one of two ways, right? Either you didn't prepare correctly or you're admitting that you've made a mistake and you need to make a change. And, we'll see. I mean, the proof is going to be in whether the play calling gets less conservative. It's going to be in, whether they call more misdirection. It's going to be in whether whether one of the things that I noticed when I went back and looked at the tape is just the snap count is always the exact same. You could tell Michigan knew, and so you wonder whether they're going to make some changes there, and that's something that from the booth in particular he ought to be able to see. So I think there are probably advantages and disadvantages to each. I think McElwain was going to take over more of the play calling, or at least more responsibility with the play calling this week, regardless. And so,
I'm glad you said that.
And so having those guys go through the headsets to each other is probably a healthy thing before the play gets out there. Because then when, if Florida's offense struggles, McElwain has to say it went through me, right? I mean, he heard the play call before it went out on the field. This wasn't something where he just said, you know what, I'm going to let Doug deal with that. At this point now, McElwain is integrally involved, and he's not going to be able to deflect that. He's going to have to take that heat. And, I think he needs to do that as the head coach.
Yeah, another thing is I don't think we need to be naive enough to think that this is the only change as well. It's the most public change that McElwain and that they can make public. But you got to believe there are other things going on behind the scenes to get whatever happened against Michigan figured out. Whether it be some tendencies where Nussmeier and McElwain have sat down and figured out some things. I find it hard to believe that this is the only change that we'll see. I'm sure there's some talking to from McElwain to Nuss saying, hey, look, we got to get more aggressive at times. We can't go into a shell. We can't get so conservative. We can't get so predictable. I mean, there are stats out there that lets you know how much Florida runs on second down, and it's not very hard to figure out. Florida likes to run on second down after whether it be a hardly any gain on first down or somewhat of gain on first down. Second and long, and they're still running the ball at times. And, there are a lot of stats out there that show how predictable this offense is. So I think if there's a lot of people in the media who can go out there and show stats like that this coaching staff also has to be able to see that and know that, and things need to change.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I think you do get by moving Nussmeier up to the box is that he has to delegate. So whether McElwain is the one who takes the role in consoling Franks when he comes over to the sideline and coaching up Franks when he comes to the sideline, or whether that's another coach. I mean, you've got multiple coaches on this team who should be able to take that responsibility. It doesn't necessarily have to be Nussmeier. So this will force him to delegate and make him pay attention to the things you're talking about, right? So if you're busy talking to your quarterback about the things that he's struggling with on the sidelines, you can't necessarily be thinking about what are you going to be calling on the next drive? Are there any tendencies going on? And I wonder whether if that's just what's going on, that it's essentially the offensive coordinator is being overloaded by having to coach 3 different quarterbacks coming into that Michigan game, having to coach them on the sideline, and then also being tasked with calling plays. And this, moving him to the box, essentially just says your only responsibility is calling plays. And we'll see whether that forces him to delegate, whether that makes the play calling more effective. To think it's going to be a complete panacea, I think is is naive as well. But I do think that certainly admitting something's wrong is not necessarily a bad thing.
Oh no.
And like I said to start out with, it can't get any worse. So.
Will, did you get to see the press conference at all or hear anything from it today?
No, I didn't get an opportunity to see it. I did hear that that McElwain was a little bit
okay.
Seemed a little bit beaten down or just a little bit
okay. You knew where I was going with that. So
yeah.
that was good. So yeah, do you take anything from that? It was the hurricane and all that stuff coming by, and we also know the problems with the offense. Do you think these last couple of weeks have maybe just taken a toll?
I think that's possible, but I also think it's a question of, McElwain was pretty confident going into the Michigan game and making statements about going to beat them and things like that, and that obviously didn't work. So maybe at this point he's kind of slow playing going into the Tennessee game, and sort of playing Eeyore during the press conferences, figuring he got criticized one way, so he may as well get criticized the other.
Yeah, for sure. Mike, you there?
I am.
There we go. Mike Loveall is going to join us from the Tennessee side. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you guys doing down there in Florida?
As good as can be right now. I got lucky enough to where I was only out of power for about 17 hours, and I'm away from the flooding in downtown Jacksonville. So besides that, everything's good. I still, of course, feel sorry for everybody who has to deal with it, and we have a lot of listeners who are dealing with it. But hopefully this podcast can be some sort of disguise in making them feel a little bit better and getting their minds off of what they're dealing with.
Yeah, that's a great thing about sports. Oftentimes it can be a distraction from real life. Sometimes that's a positive, a distraction from the stress and work. Sometimes it's a distraction from bad things that happen. So, yeah, absolutely. All rivalries aside, I hope that everybody down there in Florida is safe and unharmed after the weather that came through.
And I think we really ought to, give some thanks to Tennessee's staff and the athletic director and some of the local UT police who volunteered their time to come down to Gainesville and make this game happen down there. It's certainly a distinct 180 from the experience that Gator fans experienced with LSU last year. So, it's really been good to see from Tennessee.
Well, I won't make any comments about last year, but that's kind of the way Tennessee rolls.
So Mike Loveall, that's who's joining us here. He's a good friend and colleague of mine. We've been doing kind of videos and we used to write together on Last Word of Sports, but Last Word on College Football is now what it's called with Mike. He's the managing editor there at Last Word on College Football, where he provides his thoughts on Tennessee, the SEC, and college football in general. So, Mike, can't thank you enough for joining us here on Gators Breakdown for Tennessee Week again.
Dave, always happy to be here.
For sure. So, we'll dive straight into it and get some thoughts from you with this big rivalry game. How big of a game is it for Butch Jones? We all know how big it was for him last year, and he got the win, but then, still went on to drop the ball and not win the East. I think this is a referendum game for both head coaches for this season. So to extend that, how important do you also think it is for Jim McElwain?
Yeah, it's to me, it seems like every game's important for Butch Jones. It's almost like every game is a referendum. You look at Georgia Tech and you think, he's got to win this out-of-conference game because he struggled in the SEC. You look at last year's Florida game, definitely a big-time game for him. Last year's Georgia game, he did himself no favors. He's going to have to play South Carolina and Vanderbilt. Those are going to be referendum games for him this year because of the losses last year. As you know, the Vol fan base is kind of split on Butch Jones. In the history of Tennessee, some of our great coaches, Johnny Majors was fired because he couldn't beat Alabama. Phil Fulmer was fired because he couldn't beat you guys. So if Butch can win consistently against Florida, that'll be something that resonates with the fans. I've talked about this with Tennessee fans a lot. Tennessee has this syndrome of being the second best in the SEC. If you look at the history of the SEC since 1933, Tennessee is kind of the number 2 team overall, second most wins, second most championships, all that kind of stuff. And, obviously recently you can make a compelling argument that it's different, but the history of the league And growing up for a lot of Vol fans today, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, Tennessee was always number 2 team. So what really irks Tennessee fans about Florida is they see that since the mid 90s, Florida has kind of ascended to that number 2 spot. And, Tennessee always wanted to ascend over Alabama into that number 1 spot. And then along comes Florida in the 90s and kind of moves into that number 2 slot, threatening Florida. So that's really kind of what irks a lot of Tennessee fans about Florida. Obviously, the rivalry wasn't very big until 1992 when the conference split into two conferences. So if Butch can win consistently against Florida, that's going to resonate with the fans. So I don't know that this is a referendum game because he has so many referendum games on the schedule. But if he can consistently beat Florida, that will play in his favor with a fan base that quite honestly is split right now on Butch Jones. I personally think he's a good coach, but he's got to get over that 8-4 regular season hump. He's got to win an East championship in the next year or two, or else it's going to get unbearable there in Knoxville.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I think you were fixing to go there.
Yes, as far as McElwain goes, I'm not as in tune with the Florida fan base as you guys are, but it seems to me that this is a referendum game for him, which is kind of funny because he's coming off 2 SEC East championship games. It kind of reminds me of 3 years ago, Missouri. Missouri's coming off 2 straight SEC championships, and everybody has them preseason ranked like 5, 6, or 7, and it didn't make sense. With McElwain, 2 East championships. I mean you can't argue with that. But it seems like it's a referendum game for him. It seems like the fan, just from afar, from an outsider's perspective, just seems like the fan base isn't happy. And the other teams kind of think that Florida kind of stumbled into those championship games. And by making this a referendum game for McElwain, which it sounds like the fan base has done, it kind of reaffirms those beliefs of the rival fan bases that Florida kind of stumbled into 2 straight division championships. So from an outsider's perspective, I'm really curious as to why this is such a referendum game for McElwain coming in after the Muschamp years and winning 2 straight division championships and still having to face a referendum game. I mean, are the expectations that high in Gainesville coming out of the Muschamp years? There was a lot of conversation on Vol Twitter today about the different levels of expectations and kind of a conversation kind of like this, comparing Butch and McElwain and the expectations. So it's very I think it's actually more interesting from the McElwain perspective, this being a referendum game, than the Butch perspective, because it seems like every game is a referendum for Butch.
Yeah, for sure. That is part of it. And you go back and look at it, and it's McElwain was hired to fix the offense, and the offense is still not fixed. And you go to the one game against Michigan where we thought year 3 would be the year it could change, and you get that type of performance to where the offense still doesn't look any better. And that's part of it. It was so ugly 2 weeks ago, and they didn't have a Northern Colorado game to kind of work the kinks out and make themselves feel better. So that stench of the Michigan game has been in the program for 2 weeks now, and they've fought. Florida fans have trouble getting over it. And the thing is, Doug Nussmeier's taking a lot of the heat, and McElwain to a point. I think most fans are kind of happy with McElwain to a point, unless things don't change. If he doesn't make a change with Nussmeier, if the offense continues to struggle again against Tennessee coming up this weekend, and some fans are happy with the 2 East titles, and some know that like I said, he was hired to fix the offense. Offense is still not there, and Gator fans are spoiled from 1990 on. They were Spurrier, Meyer, blowing teams out and winning in style and making it look good and bragging about it. And Florida Gator fans like to brag, and they like to brag about offense. And when they can't brag about offense, it gets quite boring.
So, hey, Dave, let me ask you this question. Let me ask you if any of the off-the-field stuff affects it. With Butch Jones, one of the things that plays into his favor is after the Kiffin, the late Fulmer era, then the Kiffin and Dooley years, he comes in, he cleans up the program. It's a much cleaner program than it was during the late Fulmer, Kiffin, and Dooley eras. He's got the APRs up. The program's healthy everywhere except for on the field. So that's one thing that kind of plays in Butch's favor. That might be the thing that puts him at 51% of the fan base instead of 49% of the fan base. With McElwain, do you think any of the off the field issues play into that? Does it kind of remind fans of the one drawback of the Urban Meyer years, the Percy Harvey incidences, the Hernandezes, the Pouncey twins? Does this off the field distraction, does that kind of play in the minds of Florida fans and kind of remind them of the one negative of the Meyer years?
I a lot of fans aren't putting this big, student aid financial thing, whatever happened. A lot of them are not really putting it on McElwain. Yes, it was 9 players who did it, but it was one incident. It's not like these are 9 separate incidents and the guys are running rogue and all that kind of stuff like that. That event, while unfortunate and while it is 9 players, a lot of fans aren't really putting that on McElwain's plate. So a lot of the off the field issues, not really. The Callaway stuff, maybe. He's the biggest superstar on the team and he keeps getting in trouble. And him being the face of the team at times and keep getting in trouble. And McElwain for a while was lenient in how he punished Callaway up until this student financial aid issue reared its head. And now we don't even know if Callaway will play again for Florida. So a lot of the off the field issues, Callaway's really about the only thing you can really point to about McElwain and how he catered to him in that aspect. But now going forward with the other 8 guys for that, I don't think really if fans are holding that over McElwain's head. What's your thoughts on that, Will?
No, I mean, I think really the impact has probably been the negative news over the last 3 weeks heading into the Michigan game. And the Michigan game was like one more negative data point. And so it feels like you're 4 or 5 weeks into a season where you've really only played one game and everything has been negative leading up to it. So I can understand why people would be frustrated in that capacity. I don't necessarily think that it's a reflection on McElwain, or at least most people aren't making it a reflection on McElwain. But the biggest issue is just, the offense has gotten worse since he's taken over and he's an offensive coach. And that, I think, has really drawn the ire. I mean, people were not happy with the Muschamp offense, and the offense under Nussmeier and McElwain has actually been worse, which to me is where the ire is probably coming from. So, that's really that was his strength as a head coach coming in, and so it's confusing as to why they're having so much trouble getting traction on that side of the ball. And I suppose that sort of goes to my next question, which Mike, what do you think are Butch Jones' strengths as a coach? I mean, you talked a little bit about the off-field incidents being getting rid of based on the previous regime. But what do you think his strengths are? Because I think we hear a lot about his weaknesses. I'm not sure I've heard a lot about what his strengths are.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I have this conversation a lot with the volunteer fans. First of all, is clearly his strength is his recruiting. The guy can recruit like with the best of them. He's got another top 5 class for 2018. We're only two games into 2017, and of his past 5 recruiting classes, he's had 1 top 5, 2 top 10s, and then top 25. And all that with a 5-7 season, a 7-6 season, and 2 9-4 seasons. So his strength is clearly recruiting. But here's the other thing about Jones. He really connects with the players. He's a players coach, and he really connects with those guys. And he takes a lot of flack for all of his sayings, his euphemisms, his slogans, all that. But when he says that stuff, he's not talking to the media and he's not talking to the fan base. He's talking to the high school kids out there who are looking at what college they're going to play. And, that stuff resonates with them. You can make fun of it all you want, but inside the locker room, that stuff resonates with those kids. And you can tell, if you look into what happened with Jalen Hurd last year, there was a lot of locker room leadership. That was really a player's decision. I think his great strength, other than recruiting, is the way he connects with the kids in the locker room, the young men in the locker room, and the way he develops a very tight bond. That locker room is pretty tight, very tight, and it's very insulated from a lot of the negativity that's outside the locker room. And when I say negativity, some of that's negativity, some of it's legitimate critiques. He's made a couple bad decisions 2 years ago against you guys in Gainesville, kind of mismanaged the fourth quarter. The chart said go for 1 when clearly they should have went for 2, so on and so forth. He's gotten better, I think, at his in-game coaching. But I think really his 2 great strengths are his recruiting and just the way he connects. That locker room. There's a lot of bad things that have happened in the Butch Jones era the past 4 years to the team that could have broken the team. They've shown a lot of resiliency and they've shown a lot of togetherness. And I know a lot of football teams have togetherness, but they've really battled through a lot of critiquing, a lot of negativity in Knoxville, and a lot of people who have run out of patience with the cliches and the slogans. And, Tennessee fans are ready to get back to national prominence. They're ready to get back to 1 and 2 loss seasons and a national championship every 10 years and competing for championships every year. So they're kind of losing patience with him. Those slogans wear thin, but he really connects with his players and he builds a tight locker room. I really think that's his strength, really the intangibles, that and recruiting.
Yeah, I can agree with that, Mike. That's from afar. That's kind of how I see it too. Maybe on the field, still maybe some learning to do, but with the recruiting and with the way, even the slogans, as much as rival fans can make fun of it, and as much as Tennessee fans are probably tired of it, it really does seem to resonate with the players. And, I don't know what happened with the trash can last weekend. We didn't get to see it, but, it was kind of I know it was a national story after the Georgia Tech game and everything. Did they get rid of it for the Indiana State game, or was it just a thing for that first game only or something like that?
No, the funny part is the trash can was there all last season. We've had the trash can for 2 seasons now. It's simply well, the reason you didn't see it last week is because we didn't get any turnovers last week.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So there was no ball to put in the trash can. What was different about the Georgia Tech game was there was a assistant coach, a QC coach or an assistant strength coach or whoever who was holding it up the whole time. That was the one difference. But they had the trash can last year. They dunked the balls in it. Alabama's got the belt. Was it Georgia or Notre Dame one that's got
Georgia's got the shoulder pad spikes.
Yeah, the shoulder pad spikes. So every team's got that. It's just Butch Jones and the Tennessee coaching staff, whatever they do, if they started handing out gold bricks to fans in attendance, people would start mocking. People would mock them for handing out gold bricks. They really would. It's to the point now where he can't win with anything, so he might as well just do what he does and just roll with it. So Tennessee had the trash can all last season, but just once the trash can got a Twitter account, it was all over the news.
Okay, let's move on the field a little bit, Mike. For half the game, it'll be weakness on weakness. The Florida offense versus the Tennessee defense. Which matchup are you looking for those sides of the ball as key for either team to come out on top?
Yeah, I think with Florida, the thing I'm going to look at on our defense, I think our defensive line is going to hold up okay against the rush, particularly if Scarlett doesn't play, which I don't think he is. You can correct me on that. But what's killed us in the past is these tight ends. When our linebackers try to assist in the run game too much and they play too close to the line of scrimmage, the tight ends in the passing game with quarterbacks who might not be having success down the field. So I'm going to be looking at Colton Jumper, of course. He's filling in for Darren Kirkland Jr., who's probably out for the season with injury. So I'm really going to be looking at our linebackers. Those are the guys who are going to have to be stretched left and right laterally and going to have to defend that tight end across the middle in a passing game that I expect Florida will try to get going to build some rhythm. And the best way to get a passing game going is those short passes that get you first downs, the ones 6, 7, 8 yards across the middle. And I think Florida in the past has really utilized tight ends. Teams have been successful with their tight ends against Tennessee in the last 2 or 3 years. So I'm really going to be looking at the linebackers for Tennessee's defense against the short passing attack of Florida. I think Florida is going to try to establish just a little bit of rhythm, win the field position battle, which I think is what allowed Tennessee to hold leads against Florida in the last couple of years before they gave them away, was tremendous field position. So really, I think the key for Tennessee is going to be the linebackers. Are they going to try to sell out to stop the run game and to force Florida's quarterbacks into a vertical passing game, or will they be susceptible to the tight ends and allow Florida to get into a passing rhythm? That's really what I'm going to be looking at mostly on the UF offense versus UT defense side.
You guys have lost a lot of firepower on the defensive line, particularly Derek Barnett and Corey Vereen. And I'm curious as to how their replacements look. And do you think that, that was a lot of pressure? I think it was 20 of the 31 sacks that Tennessee had last year. And obviously it's hard to gauge pressure against Georgia Tech, but have you been impressed with their replacements, or do you think they're going to struggle to get the Franks?
Well, I think this is one of the things that make Tennessee fans very anxious and nervous going into Saturday. This is going to be the third game of the season. There's still a lot of questions to be answered, and that's one of them. How's Jonathan Kongbo going to do, and how's Alexis Johnson going to do on the ends there? and will they be able to get consistent pressure against a quality team? Indiana State didn't pass a lot either. I thought Jonathan Kongbo did okay against Indiana State, an FCS team. He got to the quarterback a little bit late. Most of the Indiana State throws were 3-step drops and quick passes. And like you said, you can't really judge too much against Georgia Tech. The defensive end against Georgia Tech is basically a 5-2 end on a Bear defense, so they're really contained for the run. The talent and the ability is there. Like I said, Butch recruits tremendously. Jonathan Kongbo is a freak of an athlete. It's just how well would that translate into on the field performance? I think they'll be able to get pressure. I'm hopeful they'll be able to get pressure. But like most Vol fans, I'm not certain they'll be able to get pressure. And that's one of the reasons why the third Saturday in September is so important to these two teams, is because it's usually since the early 90s, it's usually the first big test for both teams coming into the season. So a lot of questions to be answered, and that's one of the top questions for Vol fans. Can our defensive line step up and control the line of scrimmage and get pressure on the quarterback?
Mike, let's move to the other side of the ball. Who needs a bigger game for Tennessee to leave the swamp as winners here? Quentin Dormady or John Kelly?
A bigger game, I think Quentin Dormady, and here's why. If Florida knows what they're going to get in John Kelly, they're going to get a hard-nosed running back, a guy who can get that first down on 3rd and 4, 2nd and 5, 2nd and 6. For Tennessee to be successful, to beat what's still a pretty good defense, even a very good defense, they're going to have to be multifaceted. Dormady's going to have to connect in the passing game. He got better in the second half against Georgia Tech. He did okay against Indiana State. He missed two deep throws early on that would have just absolutely put that game away, and second string would have played starting at halftime. I think what's going to be critical for Dormady is to get into rhythm early. He's got a great arm. If you look at the Georgia Tech game, I think he was really nervous. He was opening his hips on his throws, and that's what was causing the first half passes to be off. He was throwing, it was a textbook mechanical error on a quarterback just with his hips open. You can see it clearly on the film. I think if he can get into rhythm early, I think we have the weapons on the outside, yet unproven except for Callaway, but I think we have the weapons on the outside that Tennessee can get into a rhythm on offense against Florida's defense. Kelly's going to give you Kelly's a known commodity coming out of last year and seeing him on a film, very consistent player. So I think it's more important that Dormady has a big day. If Dormady has a big day, I think Tennessee can win in the swamp.
Yeah, so you mentioned those weapons on the outside. Obviously, Juwan Jennings is out, and he's the one that Florida's been tormented by the last 12 months. But it looks like Tyler Bird and Latrell Williams are questionable. Josh Smith is probable. And then you've got Marquez Callaway and Brandon Johnson. I guess who do you specifically think is the weapon that Florida's going to have to watch out for? Obviously, Callaway made some big plays against Georgia Tech, but I'm curious as to who you think Florida's going to need to shut down.
Yeah, I think Larry Scott's going to try to get all of them involved. Josh Smith is going to be a possession type guy. Think Wes Welker. Think third and 6, kind of a skinny slant across the middle, possession kind of guy. Obviously, Marquez Callaway, he's like the Chris Carter of the SEC. All he does is catch touchdowns. He's got 5 receptions on the season for 3 touchdowns. Nobody wants to be a couch coach. But a guy with 5 catches and 3 touchdowns, we might want to get the ball in his hands 1 or 2 more times in a game. Tyler Bird's going to play. I think Tyler Bird is going to be used as a weapon in the run game from a receiver position. Here's the thing with the RPO offense, the spread offense like Tennessee runs, is if you don't respect the quarterback pulling the ball and running it off the opposite tackle, you got to respect somebody. I think you're going to see Tyler Bird. First of all, he's going to play. Second of all, I think you're going to see Tyler Bird in that motion right before the snap, simulating or threatening the jet sweep a lot. And I think that's what's going to empower, that spread run that you see out of the Tennessee's offense. With Josh Dobbs, you didn't have to do that because you always had to respect Joshua Dobbs' running ability. With Quentin Dormady, not so much. You're willing to give up 1 or 2 10-yard runs a game so that you can stop John Kelly on the inside run. But if you have Tyler Bird always threatening that sweep, the jet sweep, I think that changes the dynamics, that changes the read for Florida's offside defensive end. So I think you're going to see Tyler Bird used more so in that slot jet sweep position in the read option game. And I think I think he brings a certain threat. He's a tremendous athlete. So I think that's how they're going to integrate Tyler Bird into the offense. Smith possession, Callaway, like I said, they'll go to in clutch situations. He's kind of dormant. He's a clutch guy now. And then you're going to see Brandon Johnson and Jeff George in the red zone. Those guys are tall. They can go up for the ball. They are those guys are those perfect inside the 30-yard fade route into the end zone type of guys. They can go up, high point the ball, and come down with it. And I think you'll see them utilized inside the red zone.
Mike, there was somewhat of a quarterback battle coming into the season. It does look like Dormady, is the unquestioned starter right now. Is there a chance we see Garantano come in and maybe for a change of pace, or if Dormady's not getting the job done early in the game?
I think the only way you're going to see Garantano is if Dormady really struggles and has, a couple turnovers, maybe an interception or two, coupled with a fumble. Or if Tennessee's up by 3 touchdowns, I'm not saying they will be, but if Tennessee's up by 3 touchdowns, I think, they'll try to get him in late in the fourth just to get him used to that, the high pressure situations, or at least, a hostile environment on the road. Cause they think they're going to need him at some point in the season. And with the way quarterbacks do in college football and NFL these days, there's reason for that. But I don't think it's likely we're going to see Garantano in this game. I don't think Tennessee's going to be blown out. I don't think Tennessee's going to be blowing out Florida either way. I think it's going to be a close game. And unless Dormady has a really bad day with a couple interceptions and the fumble, I just don't see Garantano getting in this game.
So you did mention that Dormady is a little bit more of a static target maybe than Josh Dobbs has been, and he's obviously tortured Florida the last couple of years, and so that sort of brings my thoughts towards the O-line. And Chance Hall got hurt, I think, before the season even started. Marcus Tatum is listed as questionable. If there's an injury at tackle, does that mean Trey Smith is sliding out to tackle, or that's an interesting assignment for somebody on the road, even a 5-star recruit.
Yeah, I don't know that Trey Smith would slide out there. All 6 of Tennessee's primary offensive linemen in the fall camp practice at different positions. I think you'll see Tatum and Richmond out there. Jack Jones and Trey Smith will start the guard. I think Ja'Shawn Robertson starts there. I think Brett Kendrick would probably be the next guy to go in at tackle. So I think between Tatum, Kendrick, and Richmond, that's the rotation at tackle. I think they're happy with Trey Smith and Jack Jones at guard, and I think Ja'Shawn Robertson there at center. So I think when you see the tackle rotation, I think Kendrick's probably going to be the next guy in that rotation between those three. I will tell you, watch out. Ja'Shawn Robinson's not a natural center, and he hasn't done it except for this year. He had some very shaky snaps in that shotgun snap. So watch out for that. Hopefully he's got that. Hopefully he's improved on that since last week. He was very shaky on his snaps last week, so just keep that in mind.
Mike, like I mentioned, a couple weeks ago, Florida played Michigan, and it wasn't all that great for the Gators. What was your takeaway from what you saw of the first game from Florida? And does it, after that performance, is there less worry now this game against Tennessee, or are Tennessee fans more confident because of what Florida threw out against Michigan? How do you see? Were you surprised how downtrodden Florida was in that game versus Michigan a couple weeks ago?
Well, I'll answer your question about our Tennessee fans more confident after that game. That's no. I don't know if you've watched this Tennessee-Florida game over the past 25 years.
I have.
But there is nothing that would make Tennessee fans confident going into Gainesville they're going to get a win. Tennessee's been snake bitten against you guys. Jabbar Gaffney with the
catch or no catch.
And for those listening on the podcast and not watching the video, those are air quotes there. The line judge there that made the call was a Vanderbilt graduate, by the way. So nothing's going to make Tennessee fans confident going into Knoxville or going into Gainesville against Florida. Now, Tennessee fans always think we're going to win. There's no matter what the metrics say, I just can't think that Tennessee's going to lose. That's just not in most Tennessee fans' DNA. But I don't think anything's going to make us confident. I mean, if Peyton Manning can't win in 4 years, and there's nothing that's guaranteed in life, obviously. So, my takeaway from the Florida-Michigan game was, Florida looked energetic, come out very emotional. The defense obviously played pretty well. I thought Michigan's turnovers were kind of I think they were more of a result of sloppy offensive play than they were, fantastic defensive play. Obviously, they were great defensive plays, but I think it had more to do with Michigan decision making. I'll be honest with you, and Florida's a good team. I had Michigan picked. I just didn't think Florida came out. It seemed kind of conservative, and it seemed the execution just wasn't there. It doesn't seem like the Florida team that I grew up watching beat Tennessee in the 90s several times and beat Tennessee in the 2000s. It just seems to be something different about the Florida program in the last since Muschamp took over. So the last 5-6 years, it just seems to be something different. And I can't really put my finger on it. Obviously, I'm not as close to the program as you, but it just seems different.
That is true, and that's a lot of Florida fans are still trying to figure that out, and a lot of Florida media is still trying to figure that out. Is why so conservative when you don't really have to be, and why look so much the same as the previous 2 years, and knowing that probably wasn't going to work, but you were going to try it anyway. You looking at it from afar, there's still Gator fans with those same questions as what you're throwing out there.
Yeah, when I think of Florida, just because I grew up in the 90s and the 2000s. Late 80s, 90s, 2000s. I think of Steve Spurrier. I think of Danny Werfel. I think of Jesse Palmer. I think of 4 wideouts and just throwing the ball down the field. And, that's not Tennessee football, but to me, that was Florida football. And Florida football was all about excitement and scoring a bunch of points and, that kind of energy. And I just don't think I think the Florida football brand is kind of struggling to find its brand identity. When Spurrier was there, when Urban Meyer was there, the Florida football brand, the identity was clear. People knew what they were going up against when they played Florida. Ever since Muschamp took over, it just seems like the Florida football brand doesn't have a clear identity. What is Florida football? It kind of hasn't seemed like it's out there and it's clear in the past 5 or 6 years.
I think that sort of hits the nail on the head when we were talking earlier about why people might be a little bit restless with McElwain, right? Is that the hope was that he would reestablish that brand, and that just hasn't happened, and that's where the frustration sort of comes from. So,
Will, you got anything else for Mike?
Yeah, I'm curious. There was an anonymous NFL scout who called some of the Tennessee upperclassmen, particularly called out Wolf the tight end and called him soft, and I'm wondering whether they whether they took that personally, whether that's something that's been put up on the wall, and whether they plan on showing the SEC that's not the case this year.
Yeah, that created kind of a buzz around Knoxville. That was published by some of the same guys who did some of the stories about Butch Jones last season. There's a lot of NFL scouts out there. There was once an NFL scout that drafted Ryan Leaf. And number 2 overall, number 2 overall in the NFL draft. So with all due respect to NFL scouts, not every NFL scout is right all the time. That guy, he's probably watched a lot of film. If he does exist, if it's an actual NFL scout, he's probably watched a lot of film. He's probably been to Knoxville a couple times. I didn't buy into that. I don't think it means too much. I mean, if you watch Ethan Wolf on film over the last couple of years, is he the best run blocker? No. That's pretty clear. He'll probably admit to that. And he said so in the offseason. He's got to get better in run blocking. Is it a matter of him being soft? I don't know that it's a matter of him being soft. Did he maybe take some plays off on the run blocking system? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know. I have a hard time really knocking these kids. They're going to school, they're putting in long hours, they're out there on the football field, and then 99% of the time they're busting their back end. So here's my thing: if I'm going to write an article and call somebody soft and say they're taking plays off, I'm going to sign my name to it, and I'm going to tell people why I said that. So that's one scout's opinion, and if he can talk his GM into believing that none of those players are draftable, that's fine. That's their call. Certainly there's some critiques to be made of Wolf's blocking, particularly in the run game. But I don't know. I think that had more to do with the anti-Butch movement amongst some factions of the fan base than it had to do about anything else. I really didn't get too much from that article, to be honest with you. Is it on the board? Probably not. Again, going back to Butch's ability to resonate in that locker room. I think they're a very self-motivated bunch. They find motivation internally, I think, a lot. And that's kind of how he builds that insular locker room, kind of how he builds that motivation and that bond between their team. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I doubt it is. I really don't think I don't think that article did much inside the complex. I think it was much more for the fans who are kind of debating. I think it was really for the pro Butch versus anti Butch crowd on Vol Twitter. That's really my opinion on that.
Mike, quickly, SEC East, we're kind of right now. Georgia coming off a big win over Notre Dame, and you got Florida, Tennessee this week, and South Carolina, Kentucky this weekend. In a way, if you want to kind of think about it, is kind of an early barometer on all of these, probably top, tier of the SEC with the games going on this weekend. So Georgia coming off the win over Notre Dame and these big games coming up. How do you see early season shaking out right now? Is it kind of what you expected? Is South Carolina kind of better than maybe, NC State was a good ACC opponent, and now they go to Missouri and get a good road win? If they can start 3-0 against Kentucky, or if Kentucky could get a win this week and are hot going into play in Florida next week, there's a lot of shaking and moving coming on in the next couple of weeks in the SEC East.
Yeah, I think we're about where most people expect. I think Georgia's still on top after that game against Notre Dame. I think their defense on paper is one of the top 5 defenses in the nation. It has the potential, I think, to finish the season is the best defense in the nation. We'll see if Jake Fromm can kind of get a couple games under his belt. They got a great tight end there that can help him out. Excuse me. They've got two all-world running backs, Sony Michel and Nick Chubb. So I think the East is Georgia's to lose. I actually think Georgia could probably give Alabama a matchup in the SEC championship game. I think Tennessee and Florida are definitely your 2 and 3 teams. We'll find out who's number 2 and who's number 3 on Saturday. But here's the thing about the back end of the East. I don't think any of those 4 teams have the depth or the consistency to challenge to get into the top 2 or 3, but I think they all have the capacity for big upsets. Missouri's got a high octane, very potent offense. We thought their defense was going to be better this year. It has not turned out that way, but they have an offense that can put points on the board. And, if they get hot, if Drew Luck gets hot, Demarius Crockett get hot, they can go in and beat almost any team in the nation if they put up enough points. Kentucky, the same. They have the potential to score an upset or 2. I don't think they're as good as some people thought they were going to be, even after a pretty solid Southern Miss victory to open the season. Vanderbilt, Kyle Shermer, Kyle Shermer's game against Tennessee last season. Yeah. I've never seen a bad quarterback play so well. I mean, I'll tell you what, he was putting the ball on the receiver's hands probably 30 straight times in that game. He looked great. He's looked great in both of Vanderbilt's games this year. We're going to see if Vanderbilt's for real. They play a very good Kansas State team this Saturday, so we're going to learn a lot about them. I think South Carolina might be a little bit better than what I thought, but we'll see if they have the depth and the consistency to make the long haul throughout the season. So I think the back end, those bottom 4, are probably better than they have been the last 2 years, and they certainly have the ability to make some big upsets. And I think you'll probably see 5 or 6 teams from the East in the bowl game at the end of the season. But I certainly don't think there's such a difference as there normally is between the top 3, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, and the bottom 4. I think the East is kind of closing up a little bit.
Anything else for Mike, Will?
No, just thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right, Mike, before you go, how do you see this weekend playing out? You don't have to give us a score prediction if you don't feel comfortable. I know how that is, but yeah.
24-17 Tennessee.
There we go. I didn't take long. What's the key to the game? Why do you think Tennessee takes that?
I think, you guys will probably disagree with me. I think Tennessee's the more talented team. And I think you guys are still missing several players, to include Callaway and the running back Scarlett. I think Tennessee gets in rhythm. I just think Tennessee goes down there and it's a statement win. I think they come out emotional. I think the 2 games up to this season will benefit them. I think they're ready. I think Butch will have them ready. I think last year's win gave them a ton of confidence. Last year's win against Florida at home, coupled with last year's win against Georgia on the road, I think we'll have this team prepared to go on the road and get a big victory. I think the key to this is Dormity's vertical passing attack. If he can connect downfield, I think Tennessee will be able to put 24 points on the board and come away with a big road win.
All right, sounds good. Mike Loveall from Last Word on College Football. Mike, man, again, you're a real good friend. We talk college football a lot, behind the scenes. But thanks for joining Gators Breakdown and give you Tennessee insight.
Dave, it's a pleasure to be on the Best Gators podcast. Willing to join you guys anytime.
Sounds good, Mike. We might get you in here for some random SEC talk during the bye week or something like that.
I'm in.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Bill.
All right. Mike Loveall.
Bill, right? Did I mess that up?
Will.
Sorry.
There we go.
Bill Sykes, right?
Fine.
Yeah, Bill's another co-host. There we go.
My bad.
All good. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. We'll talk to you later, bud.
All right, sounds good. All right, Will. You're going to have your Tennessee article or Tennessee preview released for SEC Country. Should be tomorrow, right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
We'll see. With the hurricane has impacted scheduling in many capacities, and so I'm hoping it'll be up tomorrow.
All right, so you've already written it. So if people haven't gotten to read it by the time they listen to this podcast, you don't have to spill the beans here. So people can actually go and check it out. What was the basis of the article, and what did you gather from this Tennessee team that when they traveled to Gainesville?
Yeah, so the basis of the article was going back and doing a similar preview to what I did with Michigan because, 2 games into the season, as Mike talked about, you look at Georgia Tech, it's sort of a strange offense to have to prepare against. And then Indiana State, you don't really know how important that is. So it was sort of a combination of looking at the trends from last year and seeing how they correlate to this year. And, if you look at it, Tennessee got a little bit lucky to win 9 games. I think the Georgia Hail Mary, I know, Mike indicated that gave him some confidence, but at the same time, that really isn't normally a win like 99% of the time. And when you looked at the opponents in the SEC, so Florida outscored their SEC opponents by 3.9 points. Tennessee was outscored by 1.0, and both teams played Alabama, and both teams got stomped by Alabama. So it's a pretty fair metric. And in fact, if you look at the teams they played head-to-head, and this sort of takes out Florida's just complete thud against Arkansas. But if you look at the teams they played head-to-head, Florida won by an average of 7.1 points, and Tennessee was actually defeated by 0.1 points. So there was a pretty significant difference between the two teams. Not as much as there was between Florida and Michigan when I looked at that a couple of weeks ago, but certainly a touchdown difference is a significant difference. And there were enough common opponents that I think you can really take something from that. So, that doesn't mean that Tennessee isn't dangerous. I mean, obviously they beat Florida last year. They also beat Virginia Tech, who turned out to be a pretty good team last year as well, wound up ranked 16th in the country. But they
probably had some of the best wins in the conference, but some of the worst losses at the same time.
Well, they really did, right? So they got stomped by Alabama, which, we can expect. But they also lost to teams like South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Texas A&M. So they were losing to teams that ostensibly Florida has beaten, and in many cases did beat last year. Maybe not convincingly, but Florida did beat them. So, you look at that and say, okay, well, what's changed from last year to this year? Well, obviously there's a change from Dobbs to Dormady, and Dormady may have a great arm, but Dobbs has terrorized Florida the last couple of years, particularly on the ground. And when you think about what Florida's weakness was against Michigan, it was really sort of gap integrity, and it was in the defensive, and it was the defensive backs had a couple of miscommunications. And so, I'm not necessarily sure that Dormady has the ability to take advantage of that. He's got 2 full games at Tennessee. He's obviously a junior, but, he basically did mop-up duty the first couple of years. I'm a big fan of going back and looking at what people did in high school. So he completed 56.9% of his passes his senior year. He threw 32 touchdowns, but he threw 14 picks. And so, 14 interceptions in high school is a lot of interceptions. And I think if Florida can get some pressure on him, they're going to force him into some mistakes. And I think that really may be where Florida's defense can take advantage because, that is the strength. That is the overwhelming strength of the two teams is Florida's defensive line has made explosive plays last year when they got on the field, and they made explosive plays against Michigan. I mean, Florida had 5 sacks. They had 11 tackles for loss. So, the defense could have played better. There were certainly some breakdowns, particularly in the secondary. But I think from the defensive line and the linebacker perspective, you got to be pretty happy with what you saw against Michigan. Maybe the only bright spot to take away from the Michigan game. But I think you got to be pretty happy about that. Dormady last week, I looked at the tape. He forced a ball that turned into an interception down in the red zone. I mean, it was very clearly zoned, and he locked in on his receiver and he threw it at him, and it turned into an interception. Against Indiana State. And clearly Florida has better talent than the guys in Indiana State. And so I think they're going to be able to force him into those kinds of mistakes. And I also think the loss of Jauan Jennings is pretty big here. I mean, Jennings terrorized Florida last year. Obviously, he's certainly been the ire of the memes that have been coming over from Vols fans. And I think losing him is significant. And I don't necessarily want to understate that. There was, Marquez Callaway does seem to have some big playability. He certainly showed a little bit of that against Georgia Tech. But Jauan Jennings was the big time threat. And with him not there, I don't necessarily know whether Tennessee has the weapons to attack Florida the same way that Michigan did. So Michigan very clearly targeted the freshman cornerbacks, put them in situations where they were flashing in or flashing out of zones. That's what led to the first deep touchdown pass. There was a miscommunication between Chauncey Gardner and Marco Wilson. And then, there was also a pass that Spate completely missed, where it was it looked like a coverage breakdown, but it was a pick play, and it had it had the two freshmen out there who got picked on the play, and so I don't know necessarily whether Tennessee has the personnel to take advantage of that, which was sort of the reason I asked the question about Wolf is that, he's probably the guy who's going to have to step up. He's going to have to take the linebacker out in coverage. He's the guy who's going to have to run the route beyond the linebacker, but in front of the safety that the wide receivers for Michigan were running last week. And really sort of on the critical opening drive of the third quarter, that was the critical play, was when Spate hit, I believe it was Perry for a catch, over the linebacker and under the safety, and that's going to have to be the tight end for Tennessee.
Yeah, well, watching this Florida Tennessee game on TV for many years, or also a preview leading up to the game, it was always the team that runs for the most yards wins this game, however many years in a row, however many this times, and that was the stat for Florida Tennessee. Whoever owned the rushing yardage won the game. But so for John Kelly, I found this out on Twitter from College Football Film Room. John Kelly has picked up 47% of his rushing yards after contact so far this season through 2 games. So 98 yards after contact, 11 broken tackles. So John Kelly's going to be bringing the wood for Tennessee as their offensive line can handle the Florida defensive line. But I'm going back to that Michigan game, and I think it's on the other side of the ball for Florida as well. This Florida offensive line has to find something they can hang their hat on. They need to come out pissed off. They need to come out embarrassed from the way they played a couple weeks ago. The coaches can help them out too, but part of the equation for this Florida offense figuring out is getting better play from this offensive line. So going into this, Tennessee game, I do expect Florida to try and run the ball. Mike mentioned, getting Felipe Franks comfortable with some short passes. But another thing that's going to help Felipe Franks get comfortable is this run game, being what we think they can be at times. That needs to start against Tennessee. You need to get LaMichael Pirine going. Get Malik Davis some more carries. We saw the one carry he had against Michigan, never saw the ball again. But it also starts with this offensive line. So they need to come out. They need to get a group of 5 guys, and they need to sit down. And I'm sure they've talked about it. I'm sure they were embarrassed with the way they played. They need to come out, blow off the ball, and hopefully they get that so early in the game where it helps Felipe Franks. And it helps, also protection. They need to help protect him as well. But more importantly, those 5 guys need to blow off the ball, open holes for these running backs, and make a statement after what we saw 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, the more I think about the offensive line, the more I've gone back and looked at the film, the more I actually think this is a coaching issue. I said, I think last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, that the Gators are interesting in that they average 5.4 yards per rushing attempt at home and only 2.4 yards per rush away or in neutral site games. Now, part of that is they've played Alabama a lot in those neutral site games, but they've really struggled to move the line of scrimmage on the road. And that doesn't make any sense they ought to be 90% or 80% of what they are at home, and they just haven't been. And the only game where they had any success at all was the LSU game. But when I look back, I went and looked at every play in the first quarter, and the snap count was the same for every play in the first quarter. If Franks was in the shotgun, every time he lifted his leg and put it right down, here comes the ball. And you could see Michigan's players who were blitzing, they knew. And then every time Florida ran motion, the minute the motion guy stopped, that was when the ball got snapped.
So you're telling me another adjustment the coaches didn't make.
I am telling you, it's another adjustment the coaches didn't make, and you know, one of the things I've got in the article that's coming out tomorrow is that if Florida doesn't draw Tennessee offsides in a critical juncture for a first down, heads need to roll, because Tennessee has to have seen this tape. And so one of the reasons that Michigan was firing off the ball so hard is that the snap count was the same every time, and that's one of the things that you're going to see with a freshman quarterback, right? He's thinking of, like, things are going a million miles an hour. He doesn't necessarily think, oh, there should be a delay here or something like that. But, there's got to be a reason for, a 50% drop in the efficiency of running when they go on the road. And I'm wondering whether that's just the silent count. And maybe at home, they'll be able to, they're going to run the ball better just because of that they'll be able to hear the snap count because the crowd isn't just screaming the whole time. And, we'll see whether that plays out. But it was staggering when I went back and looked at it, because I looked at that stat and said there has to be a reason for this, and I went back and looked, and it's like Michigan knows when the ball's being snapped. Like every time they knew when it was being snapped. I put one clip in the article, but you could have picked from like 12 different clips if you wanted to and known what it is. So yeah, it's a coaching issue. I think that's something that hopefully Nussmeier can see from the coaching box, and I think that's an adjustment Florida's going to have to make, because every time Michigan blitzed, they were getting to where they wanted to go. There wasn't an opportunity to pick it up. It seemed like they were in the backfield the whole time. Now, certainly, that does not absolve the offensive line when they got beat physically, but it's really hard to hold up your end of the bargain when the defense knows what the snap count is. And just the more and more I look at it, the more I think that's the correction that will give Florida a better chance to dominate up front against Tennessee.
Good stuff, Will. Good stuff there. So before we sign off on this one, I don't know if we'll have another show later this week. So, we got kind of get some predictions too. Joey's still dealing with some stuff from the hurricane, helping family out there. And I think Bill's work schedule, so that may not work out. So this may be the only episode of Gators Breakdown we'll have this week. So a lot of talk, Will. Once the game, got confirmed, it's going to be 3:30. It's going to be in Gainesville. Jim McElwain, a lot of talk about him. I mean, there was a lot of talk. This being the biggest game of Jim McElwain's career so far at Florida. I don't know if I agree with it. I think it's a legitimate question. I really, really do. Some think it is, but it's not necessarily if he wins, but if he loses. I think that's the way you can look at this. If he wins, it's just, it's another win against Tennessee. Now, if you look good doing it and the offense comes out firing, maybe, you can point to this as maybe a turning point for Jim McElwain. But if he loses this game, I think there are a lot of confidence. He's going to start losing some of the fans, even though after 2 East titles. But if he loses and the offense doesn't look good, I think the fan base really starts questioning the direction of the program in year 3, especially going on the road to Kentucky next week. So a lot of people are pointing this to as a pinpoint game, a teeter-totter game for Jim McElwain. I see it as maybe more for this season, not necessarily his career at Florida right now. I think it's more of a referendum of this season, not necessarily what's going to happen in 2018. But this year can get bad if he loses this game to Tennessee. Where does morale of the team stand now? Where does the focus of this team stand now with everything they've been dealing with since the Michigan game? Getting embarrassed in that game, dealing with a hurricane, not playing against Northern Colorado, a team where you could have gotten some confidence up, could have worked out some kinks. Felipe Franks get some more reps with the receivers. And now dealing with that canceled game, and now in question if you can play this game against Tennessee, and it's finally decided you're going to have a home game. These fans are ready. I think the fans will be ready in Gainesville. I'll be there. You'll be there. Joe will be there. So, we'll be looking for people out there who listen to us. We'll send out tweets where we're tailgating or whatever. But based off of that, is it a legitimate question? Is this the biggest game of Jim McElwain's career so far at Florida?
That's a tough one to answer, to be honest with you. I think yes, just because of what it means. I think the recruiting momentum of the offseason and all that sort of stuff can unravel pretty quickly. I think everybody remembers the 4-8 season for Muschamp. And if you start out 0-2, you're sort of heading down that road, and you start, again, the Muschamp 2.0. We talked about that last week, and that's sort of that's sort of where this might eventually be headed. If you can't beat your conference opponents who are either low top 25 ranked or unranked, then you're going to have real issues. You know, the I guess the real I guess saving grace for McElwain is that he has the ability to make changes. I mean, moving Nussmeier up to the box is not the only change he can make. There are certainly changes he can make that will appease the fan base and buy him some time. And he may be forced to make those if you lose these games. But you know, again, I think it's really dangerous to take a look at the second game of the season, particularly with all the stuff that's swirling around the program, and say we're going to make a blanket statement about the season or the coach in general by those couple of games. I think you need to let the season play out. I think you need to evaluate it at the end of the season. I think you need to give him a fair shot to coach through the season without as much noise as there has been, and then and then see where you stand at the end of the season. If you're just not happy with the performance, then okay, you can live with that. But again, at 2 years and 2 games, I don't think, especially with him winning the East the first couple of years, I just don't think it's fair to really put that on him or the kids that this is the most important game in his tenure.
But isn't, what we wanted to see this year was some progress, and starting 0-2, that's not necessarily a sign of progress. I do get where the angst would come from fans if starting 0-2, because of, I guess, a lot of people have seen this team as a slippery slope because of the offense. And if the defense fell off and the offense didn't improve, then this is the results that could have happened. Now, of course, you would have had an easy win, and it would have been a 1-2 start if he does lose to Tennessee, and you can still be angry at that because the Northern Colorado game doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. But I do get where if it is an 0-2 start, where this can be looked at as a referendum of where the season could be going. Now, as you said, the season will still have to play out. They could go on the road and get a win against Kentucky, and then turn around and beat Vanderbilt as well, 2-2, going into the home games against LSU and Texas A&M. And he turns around and wins those 2 games. Then kind of the first 2 games are an afterthought if you get good quarterback play from Felipe Franks, and you're seeing him progress throughout the season. But I think a lot of fans will have a problem seeing progress if you get blasted by Michigan and then you find a way to lose to Tennessee at home.
Yeah, well, I mean, so you're mentioning the word that was mentioned all offseason, and I think it's the word that is relevant here, right? Which is progress. And so the offense looked terrible against Michigan. If the offense comes in and looks terrible against Tennessee, that means something. If the final score is 24-3. That means, and Tennessee wins, that means something different than if the score is 45-42 and you lose, right? It just means something different based on what has been seen thus far. You can go, hey, the defense is young. It's hard to say, the offense has laid an egg in 2 straight games and be happy with that. And I don't think anyone will be happy with that. And I think certainly heads will probably end up rolling at that point. The saving grace, I think, is that if it's a close game, I think McElwain will do a good job. I think if it's a close game, Butch Jones will not. I think he's proven that he'll do that. I know Mike said he'd improve, but I went back and looked at that Georgia Tech tape, and there are some things there that I think that I think I would be upset if my head coach was doing in the end of that Georgia Tech game. And so, I think if it's close, especially because it's at home, Florida has a real advantage there. Is it the biggest game in his tenure? Yeah, I think the next one is always the biggest game in your tenure when you're trying to see progress, right? Yeah. I mean, if they were 9-0 coming into here, you're like, okay, well, this is the biggest game in his tenure because it allows them to solidify their position in the East as an elite team. 0-1, you're like, oh, they're holding on for dear life. This is the most important one because if they lose this one, well, where does the season go from here? But again, I think it's a progress question for this year. I mean, I cautioned people last week, and I've been cautioning people all off season that this is really a transition year. You've put in a redshirt freshman quarterback, and you've decided, I think, to ride with him. You've got a lot of young guys on defense. If you were to sacrifice the first 2 games to get those guys experience, and then you wound up, say, 9-3 at the end of the year, and you're playing really well at the end, is that worth the pain on the early side? I think most people would say that that's an acceptable thing to have happen. Now, obviously a loss to Tennessee, the noise goes up, and do you have the opportunity to grow those players that way? But I think you have to evaluate coaches on a full body of work. I don't think it's fair to evaluate them on one game. I mean, if Urban Meyer got evaluated on that game against Oklahoma last week, people would be calling for his head. Obviously, he has a longer track record, but the offense at Ohio State has not been good since the playoff last year, right? They were awful in the playoff game, and they've been awful against both Indiana until like late in the second half. I think that was more Indiana than it was Ohio State. They're really bad against Oklahoma, and I'm not sure that Ohio State's a real good team. And so, if you're evaluating offenses on one game, my point is that you can have two really good teams, and one can dominate the other one, and one team can look like it can't move the ball, and the next week you just see something different. And I just don't think Tennessee is the caliber of opponent that Michigan is. And I think most people admit that, right? Like, these teams are probably pretty closely matched, and I think it's probably going to be pretty close. I happen to think Florida's a little bit better than Tennessee, but I can see it going either way. And we'll see. I mean, a lot of it depends on who comes out of that, on how well Florida plays coming out of that tunnel. And, certainly the suspensions of Callaway and Scarlett, we've talked about a lot, but that has an impact as well. So it's going to be a referendum on McElwain, whether I want it to be or not. the fan base is going to be upset with him if they lose regardless. I've certainly been called a McElwain apologist the last couple of weeks with some of the articles I've written following up the one where I blasted him pretty good. I think we want to see progress. And so if the offense comes out and puts up 30, I think, even if it's a close loss, I think if the offense comes out and puts up 30, things will quiet down a little bit because there will be hope the offense can support the defense. And really the biggest discouragement coming out of that Michigan game was it just looked like there was no way the offense was going to be able to support the defense. And I think everybody recognizes that the defense is not going to be lights out like it's been the last 2 years.
Yeah, I called the Tennessee game in an article with you. I called it the key game in the season before the season even started. And it was either if you beat Michigan, it was a way to continue, the narrative that Florida is back in a way. If you beat Michigan and you beat Tennessee, and if you lost to Michigan, then it was a key game, as in keeping the season from maybe falling apart early in the season. That's kind of what we're looking at right now. It's a game for Jim McElwain to reassert himself with some confidence from the fan base. So I definitely think it is a big game. Either way, the noise will be loud if it's a loss. I think he'll get some due respect if it's a blowout win for Florida. What if it looks like another fourth quarter comeback like we saw 2 years ago? I think he'll get some love from that as well. It's just we have to see some type of progress from this offense. We have to see some type of progress from Felipe Franks in this passing game. And some progress from this offensive line. Progress all across the board from the coaches and mainly the offense. And, the defense, got some things to fix, but, for the most part against Michigan, did their job. So, as you said, the word progress is really just thrown across the entire program right now, from the coaches and to the offensive side of the ball.
When I said it last week, if you're going to go down chucking. That was sort of my disappointment with the Michigan game.
Yeah.
And I got to imagine that Nussmeier's gotten a message being sent up in the box. And I would hope that if he's going to go down, he's going to go down chucking. And so you sort of asked me earlier on, what do I think about him going up into the box? And the more I've thought about it, well, maybe that makes him more aggressive just because it's a shot across his bow, right?
Yeah.
And he's the one who really the referendum on the Tennessee game is going to come down on. Because McElwain's not going anywhere. I don't think he's going anywhere even after the season unless it's a complete debacle.
Yeah.
But Nussmeier might be gone after week 2 if the offense struggles, because the boosters are going to start holding back money. And when the boosters start holding back money, that's when changes start getting made. So I do think we're going to see a much more aggressive game plan this week because of the switch in the offense, where the offensive coordinator is, and sort of just the tone around the offensive coordinator. I think it's going to be more aggressive because, again, if you're going to go down chucking.
I hear you. All right, Will, quick prediction and projection for how this game may go.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned the rushing yards. I think that's really the critical component here, and I just have not seen any ability of Tennessee to stop the run. And they gave up 122 yards rushing against Indiana State. They lost the time of possession battle to Indiana State. And so I'm actually looking for Perine to have a pretty big day. I think he's going to get over 100 yards. I think Florida's going to be able to run the ball against Tennessee. I think being at home makes a difference, what I talked about with the snap count, but also just, having the crowd in your back pocket, being able to build momentum when you have a couple of nice plays where you actually get some holes. So I'm taking Florida 27-20. I think the offense is going to show progress. I think there will be some times where it sputters, but I think they're going to take some shots, and I think they'll probably explore the intermediate area like Mike talked about, where he's saying that's an area where he thinks Florida can exploit those linebackers, and I think they're going to explore there.
Yeah, I kind of see the game going the way you do. I'm really torn on how I think. I just don't know where the focus is for this Florida team after the last couple of weeks. Where are their heads at? Losing a little bit of practice time. I don't know how much that plays into it. It does look like Chauncey Gardner is healthy and will be able to play there. So, no worry there from an injury standpoint. Goolsby and Gamble, I think, will be back as well. So, as Jim McElwain announced this week. So, maybe they can get something going on the offensive side of the ball. I do think it's a statement game for this offensive line. As I mentioned earlier, to come out mad, need to come out embarrassed from the way they played a couple weeks ago and prove the doubters wrong. These coaches need to prove the doubters wrong. I really do think this is, in a way, a desperation game from how these guys attack it and just how they, aggressive play calling, the attitude going into the game, the attitude in the game, how these guys respond. A fast start, I think, would really, really help this team. I don't think they need a fast start, but I do think if they do get a fast start, it's probably paving the way for a Florida victory. So I'm pretty lost on how I think this team will show up. There's just a lot of unknown right now. But when I feel that way, my bias takes over. I've said that many times on this podcast. So I'll go with Florida as well. Probably about the same score you got. I'll say 27-23. I think it'll be a close game. I really do. ADP may come up big in the game. Special teams, I think, will play a point. If Florida plays field position better than they did in the Michigan game, I think that's another point to look at, but I do think they air it out just a little bit more. I think Franks has 25 or so attempts. We need to see what he can get going, but I really do still think it plays off of this offensive line and the running game. I want to see some more Malik Davis. I would still like seeing some outside runs, get Tony and Massey involved. We'll see. We haven't just seen anything to know what this Gator offense is going to throw out there. We didn't see enough against Michigan, and credit Michigan for that. But I do think we'll see something different in that way. So maybe some unknown. Maybe that's some unknown that will confuse Tennessee a good bit. So that's why, some things I'll point to for how Florida will walk out of Gainesville with a victory.
Yeah, well, I think when we talked about Michigan, the one thing I said is that the margin for error was very small. It got smaller when Callaway was suspended, and it got even smaller when Scarlett was suspended. And so I took Michigan picked them by 17 because I thought the margin for error, Florida had to play a perfect game. Didn't mean they couldn't win, but they had to play a perfect game, and they obviously didn't do that. I think when you look at these two teams, Florida doesn't have to play a perfect game to win. Their margin of error is much larger, particularly with, I think, the advantage they have on their own defensive line, and then the advantage that they have in that Tennessee's defensive line is the weak spot of that team. So, if the games are won up front, then I think your margin of error shrinks. And unless Franks plays terribly or the offensive game plan looks as bad as it was against Michigan, I just think that Florida there's a reason that they're favored by 5.5 points, something like that. And I think I don't think that's a home spread. I think that's a realization that the margin for error is pretty big. So I think it's far more likely that Florida blows out Tennessee than it is that Tennessee blows out Florida. I could see a couple of turnovers really rolling downhill. Dorbandy gets pressured, throws a couple of picks, and all of a sudden Florida's off to the races. Far easier than I can see that happening on the other side. And so, again, just margin for error, I think, or room for error. I think Florida probably has the ability to win this one.
And let's not forget, under McElwain, Florida's a pretty good team at home. Besides FSU, that's really that's the team still where Florida has trouble with at home. But everybody else, Florida has found a way to play really well at home.
Yeah, well, and I think that's reflected in the rushing yardage, right? I mean, they rush the ball way better at home, and when you've got 2nd and 5 instead of 2nd and 11, it makes a huge difference in terms of what you can do offensively. Particularly the last couple of years when they've had some quarterbacks who are limited either in their experience in the program or based on arm strength. Obviously, arm strength isn't a problem with Franks, but his experience in the system is, and so if we can get him in 2nd and 5, 2nd and 3, those types of situations, I think it sets him up to be able to take shots downfield and still have a 3rd and 3 that's convertible, rather than having to run on 2nd and 14 to try to get to like a 3rd and 7 that you're able to convert. So to me, that's the key is if you really wanted to look at a key for a game, it's first down rushing average. And if they're putting up 4 or 5 yards per rush on first down, then Florida's going to be successful. If they're getting stuffed behind the line of scrimmage, well, then that's a huge problem.
Yeah, I agree there. I'm really just interested to see how Franks reacts. I guess there was still, McElwain, he did get asked if Franks was still going to be the starter versus Tennessee. So, I guess there is some thought out there that, maybe McElwain would have rethought maybe an act of desperation of maybe not going with Franks and going with Del Rio or Zaire. But I think, I was under the impression that Franks was going to be the guy anyway. So I'm kind of to see how he handles the home crowd, his first home game. And he, like you mentioned, maybe cadence and call is much different at home, and it gets him a little more comfortable. And maybe we just see for his first home game, maybe this is what it takes for a Florida quarterback to be. That maybe that's the spark for a Florida quarterback to take off under Jim McElwain is get this first big time game at home. Yeah, we know he missed Northern Colorado to get some more reps for these receivers, but I'm looking for big things for Franks. As I mentioned with him, it's blind faith right now, but I really just think he can be the guy to maybe just turn this offense around, and it starts with Tennessee.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think. I think they're going to let him loose. I think they're going to let him try. Whether he's capable or not is something we're going to find out. And obviously, that's the fun in watching the game.
Yeah, and we need to find out. That's part of it. I think these coaches need to figure out and find out what he can do, and that's part of it. They trust him. I mean, maybe in practice. My thing is they're trusting him enough to start him over Del Rio. They know what they have in him. They're trusting him enough to start over Zaire. They probably pretty much know what they have in him already, even though he hasn't been with the program as much. You trust him enough to name him starter. Now trust him enough to go out there and wing it all over the place.
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly I agree with you. I think, though, it is worth looking at, if you go back and look at Greer for his first couple of starts, they were obviously at home. They were against inferior opponents. And even his first big starts, the comeback against Tennessee was in the swamp, and the win against Ole Miss was in the swamp. And so that does make a difference. And not having to worry about silent counts, not having to worry about crowd noise, all those sorts of things does make a difference. Just getting in there, the couple of trips that happened early in the game against Michigan, those are things that if you do it against, East Tennessee State, nobody cares. You do it against Michigan, everybody calls it nerves. And that's like one thing in the tick box about, whether you should come out of the game or not. So, hopefully they have instilled in him the confidence that he's not going to be looking over his shoulder. He seemed to make the right reads, but it's really hard to get all that excited over 9 throws. And so hopefully we've got 30 to dissect after this one. And but again, I don't think Tennessee is going to be able to pressure Florida. I don't think Tennessee is going to be able to stop the run, but I don't think they're going to be able to get to Franks either. And if Franks can sit back and pick out his receivers and wait for them to come open and throw it to them, I think he's going to look successful. Now, if Tennessee gets pressure, then it's a completely different story. And that's what happened against Michigan. I mean, Franks just could not sit back in the pocket, and there were a few times he got flushed, and when he got flushed, he just ate it. Or he rushed, and one time he got the first down, and one time he fumbled it. So, obviously that's something we're going to have to watch for as well. If Tennessee can get to Franks with just 4 down linemen, it's going to be a long day for him. I just don't think they're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. The offensive line needs to, for sure, step up. So, Will, anything else before we sign off on this episode?
No, just really, really appreciative of the fans, everybody tweeting us, and hopefully everybody's safe, and we'll see you on Saturday in the swamp.
Yeah, we might be a little hoarse next week. Hopefully we are for a Gator victory. Like I said, I'll be in the swamp. Will be in the swamp. Joe will be in the swamp this week. So hopefully we'll figure out a way till we all can get together. And like I said, with hopefully cell phone signal is good enough where we can send out a tweet where we can meet up with everyone out there. So I'll be on the lookout for that. So for Will Miles, you can find Will on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. You can find his work at SEC Country. You can find his Tennessee preview there. I'm your host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.